The storm arrived the way all heartbreaks do, without warning, and with an intensity that made every quiet thing in the house feel smaller and more fragile. It was a Thursday evening in late November, and the brownstone on Caldwell Street in Portland, Oregon had never felt colder. Arthur Pendleton stood in the center of the living room with his hands loose at his sides, watching his wife of 6 years drag a Louis Vuitton suitcase across the hardwood floor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for a very long time. He was 35 years old. He was wearing a blue flannel shirt, slightly worn at the cuffs, that Vanessa had always hated. He wore it anyway, because comfort had become a private act of defiance in this marriage. "You couldn't even help me carry it, could you?" Vanessa's voice was flat, clipped at the edges with contempt. She was dressed impeccably, a deep burgundy cashmere coat, her dark hair swept into a French twist. She looked like a woman stepping out for a gala, not like someone dismantling a family. "That says everything about you, Arthur. It really does." "Vanessa." His voice was measured, low, the voice of a man who has already had this argument 1,000 times inside his own head and found it exhausting every single time. "Mia is upstairs. I know where she is." She didn't look up. She was wrestling the zipper of the second suitcase, cream-colored, monogrammed, and the sound of it tore through the silence like a judgment. "She'll be fine. Children are resilient." As if she had heard her name called in a dream, 5-year-old Mia appeared at the top of the stairs. She was in her pajamas, white cotton printed with little yellow stars, her dark blonde hair tangled from the bath, her gray eyes wide and questioning. She had her father's eyes. Everyone said so, and Vanessa had never seemed to like it. "Mommy." The word came out small and trembling. Something shifted in Vanessa's expression, not softness, exactly, but perhaps the ghost of what softness might have looked like if it hadn't been buried under years of acquisitive hunger. It passed quickly. She straightened, smoothed her coat, and looked at her daughter the way one might look at an inconvenient piece of furniture. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." "Where are you going?" "Away for a while." Mia descended 3 steps. Her little sock feet were careful on the polished wood. "Are you coming back?" The silence that followed was longer than it should have been. It was the kind of silence that 5-year-olds don't understand in the moment, but will spend decades trying to decode. "We'll talk about it later," Vanessa said. Then she turned back to Arthur and pulled a folded document from her coat pocket. She didn't hand it to him. She let it fall onto the coffee table between them. A slow, deliberate flutter that felt more like an insult than any word she could have chosen. "The divorce papers. I've had them prepared for 2 weeks," she said conversationally, as though remarking on the weather. "My attorney is thorough. The terms are straightforward. You keep the apartment and everything in it. I want a clean break." She paused, her eyes traveling over him with a slow, surgical coldness. "Lord knows there isn't much of yours that I'd want." Arthur looked at the papers. He didn't pick them up. "Is it Richard?" he asked quietly. She didn't flinch. If anything, she looked almost relieved that he'd named it, the way a chess player feels relief when the other side finally sees the inevitable checkmate. "Richard can give me the life I should have had from the beginning. He understands ambition. He understands what it means to want more than a dead-end salary and a company nobody's ever heard of." "I see. You've been stagnant for 6 years, Arthur." Her voice rose slightly now, finding its rhythm, climbing toward the familiar cruelty she wore like a second coat. 6 years of watching you tinker away at whatever it is you do at that little office on the East Side. 6 years of charity galas where I had to dodge questions about what my husband does for a living because the answer is too boring and too small to even say out loud. You're 35 years old, and you're still wearing the same flannel shirt you wore when we met. "I can't," she caught herself, smoothed her expression. "I won't do it anymore." The thunder cracked outside, and in that same instant, Mia came tumbling down the remaining stairs, her little arms outstretched, and flung herself at her mother's legs with a sob that split the room in two. "Mommy, don't go. Please don't go. Please, please don't go." Vanessa's hands hovered over the child for a moment, neither embracing nor pushing away, suspended in a terrible uncertainty. Then, with a deliberate and careful motion, she detached Mia's fingers from her coat, one small fist at a time. "You'll have your father," she said, and her voice had gone very still. "That's enough." She picked up the handle of her suitcase. She picked up her handbag. She did not look back. The car that idled outside was a black Porsche SUV. Through the rain-streaked window, Arthur could see the silhouette of Richard Sterling in the driver's seat. Collar of his overcoat turned up, the orange ember of a cigarette between his fingers. Waiting, patient and unhurried, as men with money so often are. The door closed. The sound of the engine faded. The storm raged on. Arthur stood very still for 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3. Then he turned, crossed the room in 4 long strides, and crouched down to where his daughter had collapsed onto the floor in a heap of inconsolable grief, her small shoulders shaking, her cries the raw, unembarrassed kind that only children and the completely broken allow themselves. He gathered her up without a word. He held her against his chest with both arms, one large hand cradling the back of her head, and he sat down right there on the floor of the living room with her in his lap, her star-printed pajamas soaking his flannel shirt with tears and snot and all the helpless, honest sorrow of a child who doesn't understand why love would choose to leave. He rocked her, back and forth, back and forth. Outside, the rain hammered the windows. When Mia's crying had ebbed to exhausted hiccups, Arthur pressed his lips to the top of her head and spoke in a voice so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the storm. Hey, Bug, look at me." Her gray eyes found his, swollen, bewildered, still searching for an answer he couldn't give her. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. Really hear it." He brushed the wet hair from her face. "You are the most important thing in my entire world. Not a single day will ever go by, not one, where you won't know that you are loved. Not one day, Mia. I promise you." She sniffled. "Promise. I promise." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You've got me. You've got me forever. And that is never, ever changing." Mia tucked her small face into the curve of his neck, and after a long while, her breathing evened out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. Arthur stayed on the floor until the storm passed. He didn't reach for the divorce papers. He didn't open his laptop or make a phone call. He just held his daughter. And in the quiet space between the thunder and the silence, something calcified inside Arthur Pendleton. Not bitterness, not rage, but a kind of cold, luminous clarity. The kind that comes when a person finally stops pretending. He would sign the papers in the morning. He would let Vanessa Sterling have her new life and her new husband and her clean break. He would play the role she had assigned him, the quiet failure in the flannel shirt, for exactly as long as it served him. And then, in his own time, and in his own way, he would let the world see what kind of man it had underestimated. 6 months later, Portland had transformed itself into something almost offensively beautiful. The ornamental cherry trees along Hawthorne Boulevard were in full bloom, their petals drifting down like pink snow over the sidewalks and the bicycle lanes and the heads of people who hurried past them without looking up, as people in cities so often do. Arthur Pendleton looked up. He always made a point of looking up, especially on the mornings when he rode his second-hand bicycle with Mia seated in the child trailer behind him, her little voice carrying forward on the spring breeze as she narrated everything she saw with the guileless, torrential enthusiasm of a 5-year-old who has recently discovered that the world is full of things worth noticing. "Daddy, that dog is wearing a coat." He is. Why does a dog need a coat? His owner loves him very much, I expect. Do you love me very much? More than every dog in every coat in every city in the world, Bug. This was their morning ritual, the slow, winding ride to Sunflower Academy, a cheerful institution housed in a converted Victorian on Maple Street, its fence strung with hand-painted paper lanterns that the children had made in craft time, its yard smelling of cut grass and the faint, sweet chalk dust of small hands at work. Arthur had chosen it carefully. He had visited 8 preschools before settling on Sunflower, and the quality of the curriculum had been the last thing he'd considered. What he'd been looking for was warmth, the particular, genuine warmth that can't be manufactured by an administrative policy or a well-designed lobby, the kind that lives in the texture of a place, in the way the teachers speak to the children when they think no one particularly important is watching. Sunflower had it. Miss Evans had it in abundance. He had noticed her on the first day, not in the way a man notices a beautiful woman, although she was that, in the unassuming, wholehearted way of someone who would never think to mention it. He noticed her because of Mia. Mia, who had spent the preceding 6 months becoming smaller and quieter and more careful, as children do when they are trying to take up less space in a world that has recently felt unsafe. Mia, on the very first morning at Sunflower Academy, had spotted Miss Evans across the classroom and gone still with something that Arthur recognized, with a clinch of his chest, as hope. Lily Evans was 28 years old, with strawberry blonde hair that she wore in a perpetual loose braid and eyes the color of summer sage, and the particular gift of making every child in her vicinity feel as though they were the most interesting person in the room. She crouched when she spoke to children. She remembered their small preferences, who hated the smell of the blue Play-Doh, who needed an extra 3 minutes to finish their drawings, who needed a quiet word and a hand on the shoulder before circle time could begin. She had crouched in front of Mia that first morning with a smile that wasn't bright in the relentless, aggressive way that some adults performed enthusiasm for children, but warm in the way that a fire is warm, steady and honest, and genuinely glad of the company. "Hi there," she'd said. "You must be Mia. I've been looking forward to meeting you." "You have?" Mia had asked, with the cautious wonder of a child who has learned to verify kindness before trusting it. "Absolutely. I've got a special spot saved just for you at the art table, and we have the good crayons today, the ones that don't scratch." Mia had looked at her father. He had given her a small nod. She had taken Miss Evans's hand and walked inside. Arthur had stood at the gate for a full minute after they disappeared, doing something he hadn't done in quite some time. He breathed. In the weeks that followed, he fell into the rhythms of the school run with the kind of deliberate pleasure that he had once reserved for things he loved about his work, the satisfaction of a complex system running cleanly, of small moving parts fitting together with elegant precision. He arrived early. He was always the last to leave. He attended every parent meeting and every small concert and every crayon-smeared art exhibition. And he stood in those warm, paint-smelling rooms with his flannel shirts and his quiet attention and his daughter pressed against his leg, and he felt more like himself than he had in years. Miss Evans, Lily, as she'd eventually insisted he call her, with a light laugh and a slight color in her cheeks, had begun to stay a few minutes after the school gates closed on the afternoons when Arthur came to collect Mia, offering small observations about Mia's day with the careful precision of someone who genuinely watched, genuinely noticed, genuinely cared. She spent 40 minutes on her drawing today, Lily told him one Tuesday afternoon, while Mia dragged a stick along the fence nearby. A house with a garden. She told me it was her house. She likes to draw houses, Arthur said. There were 3 people in it. Lily paused, choosing her words with the gentleness of someone navigating something tender. A tall person and a small person and a medium person with a flower in her hair. She smiled, quiet, warm, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. She told me the medium person was her friend. Arthur was quiet for a moment. She needs friends. She's getting there. Lily glanced toward Mia, who was now wholly absorbed in a conversation with a caterpillar on the fence post. She's brave. She just needs to know she's safe. How do you know she doesn't? Because brave kids who know they're safe run toward things, Lily said simply. Mia runs toward things she's already decided are good. She's testing everything first. It takes a little longer, but it's honest. She tilted her head. She trusts you completely, by the way. The way she watches for your reaction when she's uncertain about something. That's a child who knows her safe place. Arthur looked at his daughter, who had now apparently introduced herself formally to the caterpillar and was deep in philosophical discussion with it. Something in his chest moved, quiet as a tide. "Thank you," he said. "She's easy to love," Lily said, and seemed entirely unaware that she'd just said something quietly extraordinary. The city slept at 11 o'clock, and the brownstone on Caldwell Street slept with it, all except for the back room on the second floor, which Arthur had told the handful of people who'd ever asked about it was a home office he barely used. This was, in the technical sense, true. He barely used it the way a surgeon barely uses a scalpel, meaning that when he did, it mattered enormously. The room itself was unremarkable from the outside. A closed door at the end of the hallway. Inside, however, behind 3 layers of biometric security and a custom-built server rack that hummed with the low, constant authority of something very serious indeed, was the nerve center from which Arthur Pendleton managed Pendleton Capital Holdings and its constellation of subsidiaries. 14 companies, spanning enterprise software, defense-grade cybersecurity, and the new generation chip architecture that had, over the past 3 years, quietly and irrevocably rewritten the economics of artificial intelligence processing. His net worth, as of last quarter's valuation, was $11.4 billion. He had not told Vanessa this. He had not told anyone who did not absolutely need to know. He had spent the better part of a decade constructing, with painstaking care, a wall between the life the world saw, the quiet, flannel shirt programmer at a nondescript East Side office, and the life that moved beneath it, vast and silent as a glacier. He had his reasons. They were complicated and personal and rooted, as most complicated personal things are. In a period of his late 20s when money had very nearly cost him everything that mattered to him, and he had made a decision that the next person who loved him would love the man and not the balance sheet. He thought, not for the first time, that the decision had cost him Vanessa, or rather, that Vanessa's departure had proven the decision to be correct in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. He opened the encrypted terminal and pulled up the briefing his chief of staff, Marcus Webb, had assembled that afternoon. Marcus was 32, ruthlessly intelligent, and had worked for Arthur since before the first IPO. He was also the only person in Portland who knew the full truth, and he maintained this knowledge with the discretion of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. The briefing was titled, Meridian Capital Group, Acquisition Status Update. Arthur read it with the focused quiet of a man who has done this 1,000 times. Meridian was a mid-tier Wall Street investment firm, successful enough to be respected, leveraged enough to be vulnerable, and helmed by precisely the kind of men who understood capital only in terms of what it bought rather than what it built. The kind of men, in other words, who could be moved like pieces. Richard Sterling was listed as senior managing partner. His personal portfolio was moderately impressive. His professional conduct, according to the due diligence file, was less so. A pattern of aggressive tactics with smaller funds, a workplace conduct settlement quietly buried in 2021, and a governance structure that depended almost entirely on Sterling's personal relationships rather than institutional process. Arthur read the settlement entry twice. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very cold. He typed 3 lines of instruction to Marcus. The third line read, Proceed with full acquisition at the previously discussed valuation. Board transition to be completed within 6 weeks. Sterling remains as interim partner pending formal review. Do not inform him of the new ownership structure until I'm ready. He closed the terminal. For a moment, he sat in the quiet hum of the machine and thought about the way Mia had cried on the floor of the living room on that November night, and the way Vanessa had detached her daughter's fingers from her coat, one at a time, and walked away. He thought about Lily Evans saying, She trusts you completely, by the way. He thought about what it meant to build something that lasts. Then he turned off the light and went to check on his daughter. She was asleep, her star-print duvet pulled up to her chin, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he always did, just long enough to be sure of her, to feel the clean, simple certainty of her being there. Then he went to bed. The Sunflower Academy Spring Family Festival was, by any objective measure, one of the warmer events on Portland's social calendar. An afternoon of sack races and handmade bunting and tables crowded with potluck dishes of wildly varying culinary ambition, presided over by Miss Lily Evans with the cheerful, unflappable authority of someone who loves both children and organized chaos in equal measure. Arthur arrived with Mia dressed in a yellow sundress and her hair in 2 small, slightly uneven braids that he had spent 22 minutes and 3 failed attempts executing that morning. She had declared them beautiful, which he suspected was kindness rather than honest assessment, but he'd take it. The festival was in full swing. Children raced across the lawn with the anarchic joy of creatures newly released from classroom confinement. Parents balanced paper plates and plastic cups and the conversational demands of people they saw only in this exact context. Lily moved through it all like water, pausing here to steady a child who'd tumbled, stopping there to admire a drawing with genuine attention, catching Arthur's eye across the lawn at one point with a smile that was somehow both public and private, the way the best smiles are. He didn't notice the car until it was already in the parking lot. A gunmetal gray Bentley, Vanessa's taste. She came through the gate in a white Chanel suit with sunglasses she didn't remove, which in May in Portland was a choice, and Richard Sterling followed 2 steps behind her, broad-shouldered, salt and pepper, the specific kind of handsome that requires expensive maintenance and knows it. He wore the look of a man doing his wife a favor, which is to say he wore faint boredom laced with conditional generosity. Arthur watched them from across the lawn. Mia had not seen them yet. She was in the middle of a fierce negotiation with a boy named Oscar over possession of a yellow jump rope, and her full attention was committed. Richard Sterling was one of the festival's external sponsors. He had written a check in November that had paid for the new climbing structure in the playground, and Vanessa had likely insisted on this specifically because it meant they could turn up at moments like this one and feel gracious. This was the architecture of her generosity: strategic placement, maximum visibility. It took Vanessa approximately 4 minutes to locate Arthur. Well, she slid her sunglasses down her nose and regarded him with the expression of someone who has discovered an expected but still disappointing stain on a white tablecloth. There you are. Same shirt, different day. Arthur met her eyes pleasantly. Vanessa. Richard did not offer his hand. He looked at Arthur the way men like Richard Sterling look at men they have categorized and found uninteresting, briefly, dismissively, already turning his attention elsewhere. Is she here? Vanessa's eyes scanned the yard. Mia, is she? She spotted her daughter then, and something crossed her face that might have been feeling, if feeling hadn't been so carefully managed. She started toward her. What happened next took perhaps 90 seconds and carried the full weight of a moral education. Vanessa crouched in front of Mia with a smile engineered for public consumption, and in her arms was a gift, a large, elaborate toy set, the kind that costs enough to signal intent without requiring actual knowledge of the child's preferences. She set it down in front of Mia with the smooth confidence of someone presenting an irresistible offer. Sweetheart, look what we brought you. From Richard. Mia looked at the box. She looked at Vanessa. She looked at Richard, who was not crouching, was not at eye level, was not making any particular effort to be seen as a person by a 5-year-old child. You can call him Daddy Rich, if you like, Vanessa said, and her voice had taken on the particular sweetness of someone who is absolutely certain of the outcome and enjoys the formality of the ceremony anyway. The effect on Mia was immediate and devastating. Her face crumpled. Her small hands came up to cover her mouth. She took 1 step back, then 2, and then she was behind Arthur's legs, her face pressed into the back of his jeans, both arms wrapped around his knee with the grip of someone holding onto the only fixed point in a tilting room, crying, not loudly, but in that breathless, suppressed way that is somehow worse than wailing, the sound of a child who has learned to be small about her pain. Mia. Arthur crouched immediately, turning to her, his voice low and steady. Hey, I've got you. Look at me. I want to go home, she whispered. Look at me first, bug. She did, her wet gray eyes finding his, and he held her gaze and kept his expression calm and certain, because he knew, had learned this with the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, that the most important thing he could give her in these moments was the unambiguous fact of his steadiness. I've got you, he said again quietly. I've got you. Oh, for heaven's sake. Vanessa had straightened, and her voice had dropped the public sweetness. She's being dramatic. Mia, come on. The toy is right here. That's enough. The voice was calm, clear, and carried the particular authority of someone who has made a professional study of the difference between what children need and what adults want for them. Lily Evans had materialized from somewhere to Arthur's left, and she was standing now between Vanessa and Mia with the quiet, planted certainty of someone who has no intention of moving, her arms loosely at her sides, her green eyes level and direct. I'm sorry, Vanessa said. I said that's enough, Lily repeated, without raising her voice. You're at a children's event, and what you just did, presenting a stranger to a 5-year-old as a replacement for her father, in public, without preparation, without consent, was unkind and it was wrong, and it's caused a child distress. I'd like you to take a step back and give her some space. Richard Sterling made a sound in his throat that was meant to be a laugh. Do you know who you're speaking to? I'm her teacher. Lily didn't look at Richard. She kept her eyes on Vanessa with the steady, uncowed attention of someone who is very clear about what they're defending. And in this space, on this property, the welfare of this child is my responsibility. I'm asking you, respectfully, to take a step back. The lawn had gone quiet around them in the radius of a small storm. Vanessa looked at Lily with the focused dislike of a woman who has just encountered an obstacle she didn't anticipate. Then she looked at Arthur, her expression shifting to something almost contemptuous, as though she was on the verge of remarking on what it said about a man, his world, his ambition, that a preschool teacher was fighting his battles for him. She said nothing. She pulled her sunglasses back up and turned away, her hand finding Richard's arm. Arthur stood, Mia still tucked against his side, and looked at Lily. She turned to him, and for a moment her professional composure softened just fractionally, enough to let through something real, something that was neither composed nor calculated, just honestly warm. She glanced down at Mia, then back up at him. "She okay?" she asked quietly. He looked at his daughter, who had gradually untucked herself from his side, and was now watching Lily with the careful, measuring attention of someone who has just witnessed a thing they want to understand. "She will be," he said. Lily held his gaze for one beat, too. Then she crouched down to Mia's level, one hand very gently touching her shoulder. "The cookies are ready, if you want to help me frost some. Oscar has already eaten 3 and is absolutely not supposed to tell anyone." Mia sniffled. A shadow of something crossed her face, not quite a smile yet, but the architectural blueprint of one. "Did he eat the sprinkles too?" "All of them," Lily said gravely. "It's a crisis." Mia took her hand. Arthur watched them walk across the lawn together, small and medium, the afternoon light catching the strawberry gold in Lily's braid, and felt something shift in the architecture of his interior life. Something old and calcified and cold began, quietly and without announcement, to loosen. He stood in the middle of the festival with the warm May sun on the back of his flannel shirt, and he let it. He asked her, clumsily, the following Friday. He'd practiced several variations on the walk to the school gate and discarded all of them, and what came out was, "Mia wants to go to Washington Park this weekend and make a proper picnic of it. I was wondering if you'd want to come. If that's, I know it's outside of, I mean, you probably." Lily's smile stopped him. "What time?" she said. Sunday came in the gold and unhurried way of late spring days that seem almost self-conscious about their own beauty. Washington Park was easy with it, the roses not quite ready, the grass high and green, the Douglas firs standing in their old, enormous patience at the edges of the lawn. Arthur had made the sandwiches. This had taken considerably longer than he'd anticipated, partly because he was a perfectionist about all things he considered important, and partly because Mia had insisted on supervising the assembly with an authority disproportionate to her height. "Too much mustard," she had announced twice. "Thank you," he had said both times, meaning it. They spread their blanket under an oak tree, and Lily arrived in jeans and a loose green linen shirt with her hair down, unbraided, longer than he'd realized, falling past her shoulders, carrying a tin of lemon shortbread that she'd baked that morning and a slightly battered library book about birds of the Pacific Northwest that Mia had mentioned wanting 2 weeks ago, without any obvious expectation of being remembered. Mia took the book with both hands and turned immediately to the spotted owl section, because of course she did. They ate. They were easy with each other, the way people are when the conversation doesn't need to prove anything. Lily asked Arthur about his work without the leading edge of assessment. Not what company, what title, what salary, just what do you actually do all day, what part of it do you like? And he found himself describing the architecture of large-scale distributed systems in terms that were true if incomplete, and she listened the way she always listened, as though the subject was inherently interesting because the person speaking was inherently interesting. He asked her about teaching, and she talked about it with the unguarded love of someone who has found the thing they were built for. The specific satisfaction of watching a child's face change when a thing clicks into understanding, the strange privilege of being trusted with a person during the years when they are most entirely themselves. "What made you want to teach little kids specifically?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, pulling absently at a blade of grass. "I had a teacher," she said finally, "when I was 6. My parents divorced that year and I was a mess, honestly, in the way 6-year-olds are when their world has come apart and they can't name what's wrong. And she saw me. She didn't try to fix it or explain it or rush past it. She just consistently made me feel like I was worth being seen." She paused. "I've never forgotten that. I wanted to be that for someone." Arthur was quiet too. "You are," he said. She looked at him. "For Mia," he clarified, though both of them knew it wasn't entirely what he'd meant. A short distance away, Mia had abandoned the bird book in favor of attempting to teach a squirrel to fetch, a project that was going poorly by any objective measure but was generating enormous personal satisfaction. She was crouching at the edge of the blanket, her yellow dress pooling around her knees, holding out a piece of cracker to the squirrel with an expression of grave encouragement. Then, without looking up, without breaking her concentration on the squirrel, she said, "Lily, can I have more shortbread?" "Of course," Lily said, leaning forward to open the tin. And then, in the offhand, unpremeditated way that children say the things that adults spend hours circling, Mia looked up at Lily while taking the shortbread and said, with perfect simplicity, "Thank you, Mama." The word landed in the air like a note struck on a bell, clear, ringing, absolutely unambiguous. Mia seemed to hear it the moment she'd said it, and her eyes went wide and uncertain. She looked at her father. Arthur's throat had tightened. He looked at his daughter, then at Lily. Lily's expression had stilled, not frozen, but gathered, the way water gathers at the edge of spilling. Her eyes were bright, and she was blinking once, twice, with the careful deliberateness of someone managing something real. She set down the tin. She looked at Mia, and her voice, when she found it, was soft and steady. "Come here, you." Mia went to her, and Lily wrapped an arm around her small shoulders and pressed a light kiss to the top of her head, holding her gently. Arthur looked away toward the tree-lean, jaw set, one hand pressed flat against the blanket as though steadying himself against the earth. The late afternoon light came slanting through the oak overhead, warm and ancient and entirely indifferent to the enormity of small human moments. He sat in it and let it reach him, and thought that perhaps this was what healing felt like, not dramatic or sudden, but ordinary and specific and lit from within, like the sun finding its way through leaves. 3 weeks after the picnic, on the 43rd floor of Meridian Capital Group's glass tower offices in Midtown Manhattan, Richard Sterling was having the worst Tuesday of his professional life. He didn't know, yet, that it was only the second worst. The email had arrived at 6:47 in the morning. A formal notice of completed acquisition, signed by a holding company he had never heard of, Pendleton Capital Holdings, informing the Meridian board that the purchase of a controlling stake had been finalized the previous evening and that a transitional management review would be conducted within the next 4 weeks. Pendleton Capital Holdings. Richard had spent 30 minutes trying to find a trace of it on Bloomberg, on LinkedIn, on every proprietary database Meridian subscribed to, and had found almost nothing, which was, itself, a kind of answer. You didn't hide $11 billion behind quiet, clean walls unless you were extremely careful, or unless you had extremely specific reasons, or both. He sat at his desk and felt the world rearrange itself around him. The chairman of the board had called at 8. The tone of the call was the tone of men who have been surprised by a larger force and are in the early stages of recalibrating. There would be a full personnel review. Partners and senior staff would be evaluated. Redundancies were possible, if not likely. Richard Sterling, whose entire position at Meridian rested on a web of personal relationships with the old guard, most of whom were now, apparently, no longer in a position to protect him, spent the remainder of the morning in meetings that went nowhere, with colleagues who looked at him with carefully neutral faces that meant everything. He called Vanessa from the elevator at noon. "Something's happened at the firm," he said. "What kind of something?" "A takeover. Someone bought us. We don't know much about them yet." Vanessa's voice went diamond hard. "Then find out. You're a senior partner, Richard. Act like it." "Right," he said. "And don't cancel our dinner reservation," she added. "The anniversary dinner at the Hearth. I have been waiting 3 months for that reservation. Whatever is happening at your office can happen after my sea bass." He looked out the elevator glass at the city below and thought, not for the first time, that he might have miscalculated somewhere. "Right?" he said again, and meant it even less. Meanwhile, back in the briefing documents that Marcus Webb had sent to Arthur that same morning, a single line buried in the appendix read, "Per your instruction, R. Sterling has been notified of the management review timeline. He is not yet aware of the principal owner's identity. Suggest controlled reveal at your discretion." Arthur had read the line, made a note in the margin, and gone downstairs to make Mia's school lunch. He cut the crusts off her sandwich, because she liked it that way. He put in the exact number of grapes she had deemed acceptable. 9, not 10, not 8, 9. He tucked a small folded note into the box, the way he did every day, with a drawing of a rabbit or a star or a cloud, because she had mentioned once, 6 months ago, that she liked finding the notes, and Arthur Pendleton forgot nothing that his daughter mentioned once. He sealed the box. You picked up the flannel shirt from the back of the chair and put it on. He went to wake up Mia. The Hearth was the kind of restaurant that existed in every major city and occupied a specific register of human aspiration, the place where people went to mark occasions, to transact elegance, to sit inside the idea of a life lived well. Crystal and candlelight. A sommelier who moved with the solemn purpose of a bishop. Menus that listed no prices because the menu was also an experience of confidence, and confidence does not require footnotes. Arthur had called ahead, 2 days earlier, and made a reservation under his own name. He had not done this carelessly. He had thought about it with the deliberateness he brought to everything important, and he had decided it was time, not to reveal himself, not yet, but to begin the slow process of letting Lily see the whole of him, to stop living quite so carefully inside the reduced version of himself that the world was allowed to observe. It was time to take her somewhere that matched the scale of what he felt, even if she didn't yet know the reason for the scale. He had told her only that he wanted to take her and Mia somewhere special. She had said, with the directness he'd come to love, "Arthur, you don't need to spend a lot of money on me." He had said, "I know. I want to." She had looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Mia was wearing her special dress, deep blue velvet with a white collar, the one she called her princess dress and reserved for occasions she understood to be important, which suggested a more acute social awareness than she generally let on. She had asked, very precisely, while Arthur was tying her small shoes, whether Lily would be sitting next to her at dinner. "If you want her to," Arthur had said. "I want her to," Mia said, with the simple certainty of a person who has decided. The restaurant was warm when they arrived, wood-paneled, fire burning in the stone hearth for which it was named, low music that was present enough to feel human and restrained enough to allow conversation. Lily stood in the entrance in a soft amber dress, her hair up, and looked briefly like she was deciding whether she was allowed to be there. Then she saw Arthur and Mia, and the uncertainty dissolved. She was seated next to Mia, as requested. Dinner was extraordinary, though Arthur suspected the food was only a small part of why. Mia tried the mushroom soup with the focused courage of an explorer and declared it weird but okay, which was as high as her praise climbed for unfamiliar foods. Lily ordered the salmon and spent 10 minutes discussing the merits of different styles of butter sauce with their server with a genuine intellectual engagement that the server clearly hadn't anticipated and visibly enjoyed. Arthur watched her and thought, this person is entirely real. She is real in every context. He thought about what he had been carrying for so long. The weight of a secret, the architecture of separation he built between his two lives, the fundamental loneliness of being known only in fragments. And he thought about what it might feel like to put it down, to let someone hold all of it. He was thinking about this when Lily reached across the table to help Mia cut her chicken, and her hand briefly covered his on the tablecloth, and she looked up, and their eyes met with a directness that said, without words, "I see you. The you that is here, right now, in this moment. And I am not going anywhere." He turned his hand over and held hers for 3 seconds. She smiled, small and certain and entirely honest. Mia looked between them with the expressionless, assessing gaze of a child running calculations. Then she turned back to her chicken, satisfied with her findings. None of them noticed the gunmetal gray Bentley that had pulled up in the valet line outside. They arrived at 8:20, Vanessa first, in a floor-length emerald gown selected for exactly this restaurant, because she had researched it, and she came to places like this with preparation and intent. Richard behind her, his hand at her back, his jaw slightly set in the way it had been all evening, the way it had been for 3 weeks, since the acquisition news. Vanessa did not see Arthur's table immediately. She had a glass of champagne at the bar and surveyed the room with the pleasure of a person whose exterior context finally matches the image they have cultivated of themselves. And this pleasure was real and complete and entirely sufficient for approximately 6 minutes. Then she saw him, the champagne glass tilted slightly in her hand. Arthur Pendleton, in a navy shirt, not flannel, she noticed with distant irritation, as though even this represented some infringement. sitting at a table by the hearth, candlelight warm on his face, leaning slightly toward a woman. A young woman with strawberry blonde hair. And that was Mia across from them, in a velvet dress, apparently telling the woman something extremely important involving her hands and a bread roll. It took Vanessa 6 seconds to process this, and in those 6 seconds she experienced several emotions in rapid succession, the last and most insistent of which was a cold, jealous fury that she neither examined nor restrained. "Richard," she said. "Look." He looked. Is that Arthur?" She set the champagne down. "Looks like it," Richard said, in the tone of a man who would very much prefer to be having a different evening. At this restaurant, her voice had taken on a particular quality, the quality of a woman who has a specific understanding of the world's proper architecture and has detected a violation of it. Who is that with him? Is she his? "Vanessa, he's showing off," she said with absolute certainty. "He must have emptied his savings. Or borrowed." She looked at the table again, the wine, the firelight, the warmth of the scene, and something about its unself-conscious happiness worked on her like a splinter. He's absolutely trying to make a point. She picked up her champagne. She crossed the floor. Arthur saw her coming. He saw her before she had crossed half the distance, and his expression did not change. It did not harden or close. It simply settled, the way stone settles, into a quiet patience that was itself a kind of power. Lily felt the shift in the quality of his attention and followed his gaze. She saw the woman in the emerald dress approaching with the bright, dangerous smile of someone who has identified a target, and she didn't yet know who she was, but she recognized the shape of what was coming with the clarity of someone who has seen it before. Well. Vanessa arrived at the table and paused with her champagne flute angled like a stage prop, her eyes taking inventory. The table, the wine, Lily, with the comprehensive speed of someone who has trained themselves to find the weak points in any arrangement. "Arthur, I genuinely didn't think this place was in your budget." "Vanessa," Arthur said. His voice was the same unhurried register as always. "You look well." "You haven't aged a day," she said, in a tone that made it clear this was not a compliment. Her eyes moved to Lily with the specific assessment of one woman performing a complete forensic evaluation of another in under 2 seconds. "And you are Lily Evans," Lily said. Her voice was even. She did not extend her hand. Arthur's friend. The pause was too long to be accidental. "Yes," Lily said simply. "How lovely." Vanessa's attention dropped to Mia, who had gone very still and was looking at her mother with the complicated, layered expression of a child who has not stopped loving someone and has also not yet forgiven them, and is learning, slowly, to hold both at once. "Hi, sweetheart. Don't you look—" "Mom," Mia said. Just the word. Nothing after it. Vanessa blinked. Then she recovered and addressed herself, with a decisiveness that precluded sentiment, back to Arthur. "So what is this? Is this a special occasion? Did you finally get that promotion?" She laughed, and the laugh was calculated to land lightly while hitting hard. "Let me guess. They made you senior coder? Middle management at the mystery office." She gestured with her champagne at the table setting, at the room, at the whole beautiful, impractical fact of it. "How long did you have to save for this, Arthur? Please tell me it wasn't the holiday fund." She turned to Richard, who had materialized at her shoulder. "Darling, this is Arthur. My first husband. Arthur, this is Richard. You may have heard of Meridian Capital Group." "I have," Arthur said. Richard looked at Arthur with the efficient, dismissive appraisal of a man who has made a career of rapid categorizations. The flannel shirt, or rather, the ghost of all the flannel shirts, hovered over Arthur like a category label, and Richard sorted him accordingly. "Good to meet you," he said, in the tone that means the opposite. "And who is this?" Vanessa gestured toward Lily again, her voice pulling toward sugar that wasn't quite convincing. "A nurse? A teacher? Something like that." The question was framed to place Lily in a register of modest professional occupation, comfortably below the table. "She's a teacher," Arthur said. "Of course she is." Vanessa smiled. "How sweet. I imagine that's very." She let the pause extend, letting affordable or appropriate or any number of other words live in it without being named. "Compatible with your lifestyle, Arthur. You've always been comfortable with small things." Lily set down her fork. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and steady and carried the particular authority of someone who is not performing anger, but is genuinely, principally, and completely done. I teach children who are 5 years old, she said. I spend my days making sure that little people who are confused and afraid and learning how the world works feel safe and seen and valued. I can't imagine a more important job. She looked at Vanessa without flinching. You walked out on one of those children 18 months ago. She still wakes up some nights not understanding why. So with great respect, you don't get to come to our table and perform superiority at me. Not tonight. Not here. The silence that followed was the kind that restaurants generate once or twice a year. The sudden, collective breath-holding of people who have become accidentally adjacent to something real. Vanessa's face had gone very still. Richard Sterling opened his mouth to intervene. And then he looked at Arthur, truly looked, for the first time, with the attention of someone who is not categorizing but is actually seeing, and the blood left his face. It had been 3 days since Marcus had sent the due diligence briefing. Standard protocol, a short biography, a summary of key holdings, a formal photograph. Dark background, neutral expression, the composed remoteness of a man who has learned to give cameras nothing. Taken 2 years prior, at the kind of event where such photographs are taken. Richard Sterling had looked at that photograph for a long time. He had been trying to put a face to the name Pendleton for 3 weeks, and the face in the photograph had lodged itself somewhere in the back of his mind with the low-grade insistence of something unresolved. He was looking at that face now. It was the same face, older by the photograph's 2 years, softer in this candlelight, turned slightly toward the woman at the table. But it was the same bone structure, the same level gray eyes, the same composed stillness that Richard had told himself, when he first saw it in the dossier, would be formidable to encounter directly. He was encountering it directly. Arthur Pendleton, his Arthur Pendleton, the one in the file, the one with $11.4 billion and the controlling stake in Meridian Capital Group, which meant the controlling stake in every professional relationship Richard Sterling had built over 15 years, which meant the controlling stake in Richard Sterling's livelihood, his reputation, and the entirety of the life he had constructed and sold to Vanessa as a permanent condition rather than a contingent one. The floor shifted. The champagne glass became suddenly very heavy in his hand. He felt, with the full body, irreversible clarity of a man watching his own foundation give way, exactly what it meant to have spent 3 weeks preparing to meet his new employer, and to have just spent the last 4 minutes standing at that employer's dinner table, making his wife's contemptuous theater an accessory to himself. He pushed Vanessa's hand from his arm. "Richard, what are you?" He stepped forward. He set down the champagne glass on the edge of Arthur's table because his hand was no longer reliable. He looked at Arthur, and Arthur looked back at him with an expression that was not surprised, not vindictive, not theatrical, just clear and patient and entirely certain. The expression of a man who has been waiting, without particular urgency, for this exact moment to arrive. Richard Sterling, senior managing partner of Meridian Capital Group, with 15 years of Wall Street authority and a Seville rose suit and a wife in an emerald gown, lowered his head. It wasn't a nod. It wasn't a gesture of professional greeting. It was a bow, a genuine, physical, instinctive submission to a hierarchy that had just made itself unmistakable. And when he raised his eyes again, they were the eyes of a man who has been broken open entirely. "Mr. Pendleton," he said, and his voice had lost its shape. I didn't know. I had no idea that you were." "Arthur," Arthur said. Richard blinked. "Sir, you can call me Arthur." His voice was even. "You always have." "Arthur." The name came out wrong, shrunken, frightened, a different word than it had ever been before. "I want to apologize. For my wife. For what was said at this table. I had absolutely no idea." "I know you didn't," Arthur said. "Mia," Lily said quietly, "I want you to look away for just a moment." And Mia, who had been watching all of this with wide, expressionless attention, obediently turned and looked very carefully at the breadbasket. Vanessa was making a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a reality that has been constructed with great effort and personal sacrifice over a period of years, encountering a force that dismantles it entirely, and without particular interest in doing so. It started low and escalated, drawing the attention of the nearest 3 tables, and then of the whole room. He's, Arthur, She was looking between them, between the man she had left for insufficient net worth and the man she had married for maximum net worth, and the arithmetic was doing something terrible and irreversible in her mind. "You own his company," she said, in a voice that barely made it out of her throat. "You own his company. You own Meridian." "I do," Arthur said. "How long?" "Long enough." He set down his wine glass. His voice had not changed in temperature or volume, but it had acquired a quality of finality, the way a door does when it closes on something that will not be reopened. "Vanessa, I hope you've been well." "You knew," she said, and her voice had gone strange and small. "You knew the whole time. When I left you, you had all of. You were already, yes. And you let me think you had nothing. You made your own conclusions," he said, without cruelty. "I never lied to you. I simply didn't correct you when you decided I had nothing to offer." He paused. "You were wrong about what that was." The silence at their table was enormous. "Richard," Arthur said, shifting his attention, "you're aware that the management review for Meridian begins next week." "Yes, sir." Richard's voice was very quiet. "We had already identified several concerns with your partnership track before this evening, the 2021 settlement being one of them. I think you understand what that means for your position going forward." Richard Sterling said nothing. "You should take your wife home," Arthur said, "and I'd suggest contacting your attorney in the morning." Vanessa tried once more. She put her hand on the edge of the table, her voice dropping into something she may once have used on Arthur when she wanted something from him. Some reflex of an intimacy that had been transactional even when it seemed otherwise. "Arthur, we were married 6 years. We have a daughter. We have a history. You can't just—" "Mia lives with me," Arthur said. He did not look at her. "She has lived with me. She will continue to live with me. That is not a negotiation. She's my daughter, she is. And you are welcome to seek legal counsel regarding a visitation arrangement, as you always have been." He paused, and something in his expression shifted, not harder, but clearer, the way a sky goes clear after a storm has passed completely through it. "But you should know that in any custody proceeding, the court will hear testimony about this evening." A uniformed member of the restaurant staff appeared at Vanessa's elbow, discreet, firm, materializing from nowhere in the way that good hospitality staff appear when the situation requires them. "Ma'am," he said, "may I help you find your way out?" Vanessa stood for 3 more seconds in the wreckage of the evening she had designed. Then she took the offered arm, because there was nothing else to take, and she let herself be guided toward the door in the emerald gown she had chosen for exactly this restaurant, and the eyes of every table she passed were carefully, deliberately, pointedly looking somewhere else. The door closed. The fire crackled in the hearth. Mia turned from the breadbasket. She looked at the empty space where her mother had been standing, with the complex expression of a child who feels several true things at once and doesn't yet have words large enough for all of them. She sat with it for a moment, really sat with it, the way her father had taught her to, by example, without knowing he was teaching anything. Then she looked at Arthur. "Can I have dessert?" she said. Arthur let out a long, slow breath, and the sound that came out of him was somewhere between a laugh and relief and something that didn't have a name, and he reached across and gathered his daughter up into his lap and pressed his mouth to her hair. "You can have every dessert on the menu," he said. She considered this. "Even the ones with raisins. You can have them. You don't have to eat them." "Okay," she said, and settled against his chest with the absolute, boneless ease of a child who knows exactly where they are, and that where they are is safe, and that this is permanent. Lily was watching them, her hands in her lap, her amber dress warm in the firelight. Arthur looked at her over the top of Mia's head, and something passed between them that was entirely wordless and entirely sufficient. "I have some things to explain to you," he said. "I know," she said. "There's a lot of it. I figured." She tilted her head, and the corner of her mouth lifted, gentle and certain. "But I'm not going anywhere, Arthur." He held her gaze, and he believed her, in that. The simple, quiet fact of believing her was perhaps the most extraordinary thing that had happened all evening. 3 weeks later, on a quiet evening in early June, after Mia had been bathed and read to and tucked into her star-print duvet with her rabbit and her bird book, Arthur came downstairs to find Lily in the kitchen, washing the dinner dishes with the comfortable ease of someone who has begun to inhabit a space rather than merely visit it. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. Outside, the evening sky was doing something extraordinary. That specific Pacific Northwest blue that appears only in the hour before full dark, deep and luminous, as though the day has distilled itself into one final act of beauty before letting go. The kitchen was warm. There was music from the small speaker on the counter, something slow and instrumental. The whole scene had the quality of a thing that has always been, which Arthur recognized as the feeling of rightness, in which he had spent a long time not being sure he deserved. She asked for 2 extra stories tonight, he said. Lily looked up. She always asked for 2 extra stories. She's been running that same negotiation since September. She starts with 3. I counter with 1. We settle on 2. She wins every time. She has your negotiating instincts. He came into the kitchen and picked up a dish towel, and she moved slightly to make room for him beside her at the sink, the way people do when they have learned each other's physical geography. He dried. She washed. Neither of them was in a hurry. There are things I should have told you sooner, he said. You've told me a fair amount in the last 3 weeks, she said. I know. I wanted to. He stopped. Tried again. I was afraid. She looked at him sideways. Of what? That it would change what this is. He gestured, very slightly, at the kitchen, the evening, the space between them. That it would become about the money, and then we would lose this. He paused. I've lost things before when people found out. It changes the way they see you, the things they want from you, the questions they ask. He looked at the dish in his hands. I didn't want to lose this before I was sure enough of it to risk telling you. Lily was quiet for a moment, the water running between her hands. Arthur, she said, I need you to understand something. She turned to face him, drying her hands on the towel he was holding, which meant her hands were briefly over his, which she didn't seem to notice or was choosing not to. I fell in love with the man who spends 22 minutes trying to braid his daughter's hair before school. The man who rides a second-hand bike because he likes the morning and wants Mia to like it too. The man who sat on the floor with his little girl in the middle of a thunderstorm and promised her that nothing permanent would be taken from her. She held his eyes. I fell in love with that man. The other thing, the billions, the companies, all of it, that's information about your life. It's not information about who you are. He looked at her for a long time. You know, he said, most people, when they find out, their first question is about the number. I don't care about the number, she said simply. I care about whether you're going to keep making those sandwiches, because honestly they're very good and I was counting on that continuing. He laughed, a real laugh, the involuntary kind, the kind that takes you by surprise because it comes from somewhere you'd forgotten was available to be reached. She smiled. He set the dish towel down, and he turned toward her, and he said her name once. Just Lily. The way you say a word when it has become the most important word you know. And then he kissed her, gently and with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has finally stopped being careful about the things worth being reckless about. When they came apart, she rested her forehead against his and closed her eyes. I should tell you, she said quietly, that Mia has been asking, for about 6 weeks, whether I'm going to be her official family. She has. She put it to me very formally, actually. She said, Lily, are you going to be my Lily, or just the teacher Lily? And I didn't know what to tell her. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want to tell her? She opened her eyes. I want to tell her yes, she said. But I wanted to check with you first. He smiled, slow and wide and entirely unguarded. The smile of a man who has been careful for a very long time and has just decided that the season for carefulness is over. Then tell her yes, he said. She pulled back far enough to look at him properly. You're sure? I've been sure for a while, he said. I was just waiting until I was brave enough to say so. She studied his face in the kitchen light, in the evening blue of the window, in the warm and ordinary beauty of this particular Tuesday night, and she seemed to find in it everything she was looking for, because she nodded once, like a person who has made a decision and is entirely at peace with it. Okay, she said. Then okay. Upstairs, in her room with the moon and the stars and the stuffed rabbit and the bird book, Mia Pendleton was not asleep. She was lying on her back in the dark, looking at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the people downstairs, the murmur of voices, the low music, the warm and rhythmic evidence of ordinary life continuing in the rooms below. She had done this before, in the apartment before the storms, when the voices had been sharp and cold and the house had felt like a held breath. She had learned, in those months, to fall asleep to the silence between arguments and to wake up tired from the vigilance of it. But this was different. These voices were easy. They had the shape of people who had nothing to prove to each other. The comfortable, undefended register of people who have decided to be honest and have discovered that honesty between the right people is not a risk but a relief. Mia listened to them for a while, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. She thought about the drawing she had made at school that week. A house with a garden, 3 people in it. The medium person with a flower in her hair, and the tall person with his hand on the small person's shoulder, and the small person in the middle, arms stretched wide the way you stretch them when you're trying to hold everything good at once. She thought about the shortbread in the park. She thought about the way Lily's braid caught the light. She thought about her father's laugh tonight, the real one, the one that came from somewhere deep, and how she had never heard it quite like that before, and how it had felt like hearing something that had always been there, finally being allowed out. She closed her eyes. She slept the way children sleep when they know they are safe, deeply, easily, without the small night-waking vigilance of someone who has learned to guard against the absence of good things. She slept in that small room at the top of the brownstone on Caldwell Street, like a child who has been promised something and has, at last, and completely, decided to believe it. Several months later, a small paragraph appeared in the Portland Business Journal, tucked between a feature on a new waterfront development and an announcement of a city sustainability grant. Pendleton Capital Holdings, the privately held technology conglomerate controlled by Portland-based investor Arthur Pendleton, completed the restructuring of its acquired subsidiary Meridian Capital Group this week. The firm, which had operated under prior management for 15 years, has been substantially reorganized under new leadership. Former senior managing partner Richard Sterling departed the firm in August following an internal review. In other news, Mr. Pendleton's engagement to local educator Lily Evans was announced quietly this week. The ceremony is expected to be small, private, and entirely without press. The article was not widely read. Arthur didn't see it. He was at Washington Park, sitting on a blanket under the oak tree, Mia asleep across his lap in the afternoon sun, an open book beside him. Lily was next to him, her shoulder warm against his, her braid coming loose in the way it always did by mid-afternoon, a cup of tea cooling in her hand. She was reading. He was watching the light come through the leaves. After a while, she looked up from her book and found him watching her, and she raised her eyebrows in the mild, questioning way of people who are happy and a little lazy in the sun. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him for a moment, really looked, in the way she always had, as though she were checking that he was still there and still well, and finding him to be both. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder and went back to her book. The afternoon light moved through the oak. Mia stirred and settled. Somewhere across the lawn, a child chased a dog, and a father chased the child, and the sound of it carried clean and warm on the air. The city went about its business in every direction, full of ambition and noise and the relentless, churning forward motion of people who have decided that arrival is more important than the journey. And in the middle of all of it, on a blanket under a tree in a park in the late summer sun, 3 people were simply present, simply warm, simply together. Which is, in the end, what $11 billion cannot buy, and what one man in a flannel shirt had known, all along, was the only thing worth having.